Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Unsung Americans, a podcast where we share frontline stories from aid workers. If you're new to the channel, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're returning, welcome back. Today, I am particularly excited to have Andrea, an old friend that I've worked with in actually quite a few places over the years. Andrea has, I think, kind of a unique perspective and set of experiences she's going to share today. So glad to have you, Andrea. Maybe just give you a moment to introduce yourself, and we can jump into it.
Sure. I am Andrea Uribe. I am Colombian. I was born in Colombia and then moved to the US many years ago and became a nationalized citizen. I worked for USAID projects for about 25 years. I am mother of two and married to a wonderful man.
Very nice. Well, glad to have you. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate that intro. It kind of gets right into one of my first questions, which is maybe as a naturalized Colombian-American citizen, you grew up in Medellin, Colombia, and during a very insecure and a challenging time. Maybe you can just speak a bit to that. What was it like growing up? By the way, part of why I'm asking is Colombia was a country where USAID did a lot of work, did a lot of good work over the years, and was an important partner in countering what was happening in the narco wars, right? So maybe you can just speak a bit to like what was daily life like growing up in Medellin, Colombia during that time?
Right. It's, to tell you the truth, sometimes when we tell these stories, like when we're among peers and we're telling stories of how we grew up, we're surprised how we are mainly sane, because when you're telling those stories, they are really difficult stories. My teenage years happened during the 80s and the 90s, and this was like right at the middle where Pablo Escobar and all the drug cartels were doing all their things. So just an example, my house during some time the windows needed to have scotch tape because there were so many bombs around the city that the scotch tape would help you when the windows blow up. At least a big part of the glass would come together and not shatter all over so we had bombs. When a bomb would sound, like, we were already sort of very accustomed to hearing a bomb sound, and then, oh, is it far? Is it close? Do you know anything? And at that time, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have WhatsApp. We didn't have things that would let you know pretty quickly. So at some point, you would try to get a payphone and call your parents and say, hey, I am so-and-so place and I'm okay. And eventually you would realize that if everyone was okay, sometimes so-and-so's house would be completely destroyed. Some other times you would get like a window shattered, and you become so numb in a sense that you would be like, oh no, like a couple of windows shattered. Oh, okay, you guys went, it was okay. No, it wasn't okay. It's not okay that there's a bomb close to your house and your boy's window shatters completely and his bed is full of glass. Like that's not good. But at some point when you start growing up, you just have to go out. You have to have your life. And
Right.
We would be like in a nightclub and guns were everywhere. And it was so simple. Like if you pushed the wrong person, you could be put a gun in your head and saying, who do you think you are? Or cutting in line. Like if somebody would cut in line, and it was like, we got to a point that we could sort of identify who were the scary guys and who weren't. So if you're in the movies and suddenly 3 really ugly guys would cut in line, you wouldn't say anything because it would be easily, like, you could get in serious trouble and get shot. So we went out, we had parties. I had my 15th birthday party in a time that it was extremely dangerous to go out after dark. But I had my party and we went and partied until 2 a.m. So you get to a point that you get adjusted to that life and try to cope the best way. But now that I am a mom, I'm like, I don't know how my parents let me go out. Like, I would keep my kids locked in the room in those
Sure.
circumstances.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing all that. You know, it's this may be, I don't know if this is off topic or not. I don't really care. Because I can't help but think about it. How I've been to Medellin a few years ago, right, for the first time, and I brought my kids there. Medellin, Colombia is quite a safe city now. It has less gun violence than a lot of American cities, actually. And it's an interesting thing to think about that, I mean, it's a sad thing to think about, I guess, too, that how much violence and how much killing there was for how long and what it was over and what it was about. But certainly it's a positive thing now that I can go there and walk around at night, which I did almost every night that I was there. And maybe we're
Right.
in the city,
With your
um,
kids.
with my kids. Yeah.
Right.
And actually it's quite a nice city and quite a pretty fun city too. But it's it really wasn't that long ago that it was completely the opposite. And you just think about how a place can go, how quickly a place can become that dangerous and violent, and the scary things we see happening in the US now. I think it naturally makes a lot of us worried. I mean, and I don't know, maybe you as a naturalized Colombian-American, are you worried about the kind of the rhetoric? And I'm talking about all over the place in the US. I'm not targeting one person or group or anything. I'm saying just more broadly the tone and the division and the hostility in the US. What does that look like to you, given where you came from, but
Right.
as a Colombian-American, right?
So I think that one of the things that come to mind is being afraid of sending your kids to school and the gun violence that happens in schools is something that worries me and worries a lot of my friends. And it is because when we were growing up, we had friends that were killed in massacres. And so death has touched me very closely. Death, kidnapping, disappearances. It's not like I heard from a neighbor. It's people close, really, really close to me. Classmates that were dead in bombs, and really close friends that were killed in a massacre in a bar. And those things sort of change you forever. And while you try to cope and you become somebody that is sensitive and somebody that wants the best for people that are around you, those things have an impact in your life. So I don't want my kids or other people's kids to have to go through that. So I really empathize immediately when I see the moms that after a shooting or something, I just feel the mom's pain because I was one of those kids that grew up in an environment that was very unsafe. So yeah, it is scaring me. This is scary when suddenly you're not able to say your mind. I think that the US where a US that I love and where I live is that US where you can express your mind and you have that freedom of speech. Right now, I think that people are getting more scared to speak up because I live in a time that you were always scared to speak up and you could result in being extorted or dead or your father dead. Like that is scary to me because it's a little bit of a flashback.
Yeah. And I guess we got right into it there, didn't we? Maybe not what we were.
It was like cut to the chase.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing all that. Maybe looking back, how did you came to the US quite a long time, I mean, 20 plus years ago. So why did you come to the US, and what did that look like?
Okay, that's a beautiful story. So now we can tone down the intensity of the conversation. When my mom was a teenager, my grandma was a very visionary housewife, and my grandpa was a doctor. I don't remember how, but somebody said that there was an American girl, a girl from Portland, Oregon, that wanted to study Spanish. So my grandma, very smart, said, sure, if my oldest daughter can go to their house, I'll receive her. So in a time where exchanges, like university exchanges or college, like that wasn't a thing, but my grandma is like, sure, I'll let her come 1 year. My mom flew to Oregon. She stayed there. She studied English in Portland State University. She worked in a place where she was a server. And this was at a time that immigration laws were not so stringent, but she was working at an elder's place. It was just her best time of her life. So when I graduated from university, she always kept contact with this family. So I graduated and we talked to this family, and this family invited me to study English. I studied in a school where we did learn English, but I needed like a higher level. So I went there for 3 months and I stayed at their place. This was the Banaski family, a family that my family loves and will love forever. So I stayed in the house of the woman that came and lived with my family here, Judy. I studied English as a second language for 3 months, but my English was good enough to access like master level courses. So I called my parents and I said, hey, I'm starting a master's degree in conflict resolution. Like, how are you going to finance this? Like, yeah. What are you talking about? So I won half of a scholarship for the second trimester. Like I had enough money to pay for my first trimester. I won half of a scholarship for the second trimester, and then I engaged in a university research that also paid for my tuition. So that's how I stayed in university. And then when you finish school, you have a visa for 1 year. And I once again called my parents and said, well, I'm moving to Washington, D.C. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah, I have $3,000 saved. I'm moving to Washington, D.C. I want to take advantage of this opportunity. And at this time, I was with an F2 and like a student visa. So I had this authorization to work. I applied to several organizations that had work in Colombia because I wanted to make that connection. And I got a job probably the week after I moved to DC. And I worked for them for 23 years.
Yep. And that's how you got it. That's how you ended up. I didn't know most of that. So,
yeah,
no,
I was a psychologist. I graduated from psychology in Colombia. And I did some work in Colombia while I was in the university. But I wanted my impact to be my 1 hour of my work. I wanted to impact more people because I could see that on counseling, I would impact one person 1 hour at the time. But if I would expand my job, 1 hour would impact sometimes 3 people, sometimes a whole village, sometimes a whole country. So efficiency is a big part of my life. So that's why.
And that answers the question, what made you then move into doing, I mean, you've answered it, I think. Feel free to add more, but I think why do that? Why get into doing international development work as we don't call it foreign aid work, right? We've never called it foreign aid work. We called it international development because you're helping to develop countries.
Right.
Not hand out aid, right? But that's a separate argument. Go ahead.
To me has always been the service, to just serve people. I studied medicine. I started studying medicine for 3 months. I then pivoted to psychology, and it was because I always wanted to serve. But then that worry of there is so much need around me and around the world that I need to have a greater impact. And all the work that I could hear that the US government was doing was just absolutely amazing to me. Truth is, I wanted to have, I applied to jobs that had a Latin America connection or a Colombia connection. But what I really, really wanted to do was work in Africa. I wanted to go to Africa and
Huh.
have an impact in Africa. And I went and worked in Africa for the first time last.
I was going to say that I don't think you're, yeah.
No, I went everywhere. I worked in Asia, in lots of different countries, lots of Latin American countries, Eastern Europe, and Africa was never there. And last year, it was the opportunity to work in South Africa for an electrification project, and I understood why I was so drawn to working in Africa, because like the love that I even spent my birthday there last year, and they had a party for me and gifts, and oh my God, like the most loving people, and having that cultural exposure. People dress up in the dress of their individual villages, because I
Yeah.
told them that I love dresses and that I love Halloween and all those, and they did that for me. So I think that having that access to different cultures, having that access to how people see the world, and be able to be there and help them while you help yourself and grow, that's my main motivation. It's
And
not a
South
job. Like
Africa,
you can tell, it's like a passion,
I know.
totally.
Well, I know.
So
It's interesting you bring up South Africa. I mean, that was our last post overseas was, I used to live in South Africa. And for the year prior to that, we were in Mozambique. And we'd go to South Africa constantly because we had to go back and forth and renew our visas. And so we spent a lot of time there. That's a particularly fascinating place just because, I mean, frankly, you have all the different African, people who've come from different African tribes and all, but many of them all speak each other's languages. So in the office, most of our staff, I was the only American. We had people from all different tribes, and the amount of different languages going around at a given time, they would go in and out of all the different languages because they
right,
all spoke 10 languages, but, and gosh, we were there I was there when Nelson Mandela died, actually. And I mean, they had a countrywide funeral procession for him. And what was interesting then too, is we had people in the US saying, are you safe? Is everything okay? Because I think there were, I know some people abroad were assuming that there'd be instability or violence. And it couldn't have been further from that. It was the opposite. There was just this, you weren't finding people saying anything disparaging. I mean, it was this like pride and celebration of everything that he did to free South Africa from apartheid. But it was an interesting place to be too, because racial tensions were apparent, but there was also, this is probably controversial, but that's fine. The people spoke much more openly about race and racial tensions, that they hadn't hit a point of political correctness in some ways, And I actually, this is now, this is 12 years ago, but I
did
don't know
not
what the culture is
perceive
like. I couldn't
did not
say.
perceive anything like that. It was very sweet, very, like there was a really incredible flow in that
No, and
office.
that's what it was like, was the day to day when
Right.
I was there. It was
Okay.
just over time, the longer I was there, you'd start to pick up on some things and see things. And I'm not,
Right.
I speak ill of the South Africans. I'd go back to South Africa any day right now. I loved our time in South Africa. And
But
still talk.
I think that that's even saying something good about sci-fi. Like they realize that this is it, and they speak freely, so they are able to elaborate their emotions and learn. I don't know, when you're so restricted and you're not able to absolutely say anything, like it gets repressed, but like how amazing would it be to get to a point where we are able to discuss these racial tensions, or without getting so offended, and being sensitive but also open. And I don't know, I think it would be great to get in the US to
We would benefit from
that.
that. Anyhow, the interesting thing is there's probably always an assumption people make that you wanted to work in Colombia, that you went to work in Colombia, but you didn't actually end up in Colombia until years and years later, right? Doing
Right.
work. But you did work in the region. Isn't that right? You worked in Peru?
I worked, my first assignment was in Peru, and it was, I was there for long term. I was there for 1 year, and then the next year I just kept going back and forth.
Right.
It was a really large alternative development project.
Yeah.
We were giving small grants and large grants, and we had infrastructure components, economic development components, land titling components, and we were working very closely with the government of Peru in the voluntary extraction of coca leaves.
And I'm going to do some clarifying what some of this was in my own words, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Okay.
USAID did a lot of its work through contractors and nonprofits, right? When USAID still existed up until a few months ago. And a large part of the reason, there's different reasons for that, but one of them being a private contractor can operate much more quickly and efficiently on the ground in a country. They don't have to deal with a lot of the same things that the U.S. government does through its diplomatic presence. So the U.S. government sort of set the stage. They develop and manage the diplomatic relationships with the government, and then they contract out and say, we want to do coca eradication. Actually, technically wasn't coca eradication. Others were dealing with that.
It was supporting the process, but the government of Peru was working with the people to voluntarily remove
so coca production, because it was in our end. We didn't want cocaine coming into the United States. That's kind of what it came down to, right? So there were a lot of programs like that, and you got to work on one, which is awesome. And that's when you say alternative development, that was for a period of time. Several years or for a period of time, that was just the term used to refer to USAID projects that specifically provided economic development support to farmers and others to cultivate other crops and to not be involved in the coca trade, essentially, right? That's
Correct.
kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
It's not very exciting to talk about the details, but because there was all this talk of waste, fraud, and abuse and corruption, I do think it matters to speak to this directly and in very practical terms. I don't even know what the words are to describe it, because we spent so much time, and we as private contractors, we had to invest so much in making sure there was no waste, fraud, and abuse. And if we did uncover fraud, because that happens in the United States, by the way, that's not a foreign problem.
Yeah, it happens.
But if we did uncover fraud, who actually paid the bill for said fraud? Taxpayers? It was a private contractor that was managing the contract that actually absorbed the cost, right? And that's one of the biggest.
Every mistake, the technical term is disallowance. Yeah. And we would, especially in my team, the operations, finance, and subcontract, those were the teams that were in charge of making sure that we were the eyes and ears in the ground. And we had eyes and ears in Washington, eyes and ears in the capital. And this is not just Peru. It's the same structure in every project I work for.
Country.
There were eyes and ears in the regions. If we had a satellite office that was in Tingo Maria, which is the jungle, we would train and we would have people that were also eyes and ears there. And when they sniffed something that wasn't making sense, they would report to us, and we would work with the U.S. government and the IG to make sure that they would investigate, and that we would find the root cause, and the contractor would have to pay. And it doesn't matter the bill. Sometimes it was $50, sometimes it was a larger bill. And those are the contractors. And when I was mentioning earlier about subcontractors, the team, the U.S. team, wasn't able to do it all either. So we would branch out and we would find other private sector companies or other NGOs that would then implement other smaller projects in the ground. And all this was because the contract needs to complete some objectives, achieve some indicators that were connected to U.S. foreign policy. So in different countries, they would have different interests and different objectives. And then we needed all those smaller companies and smaller NGOs to achieve all those objectives. And it was just this network of people working for that.
Yep. No, I can't say I
And
miss doing. Yeah.
one thing that is interesting as to why a psychologist for Colombia ends doing compliance work and making sure that we follow the regulations and that we do things right. It's because when I first started, everything I heard was, you can't do that. You can't do that. Let's do this. No. The regulation doesn't allow. Let's do that. We need a waiver. And it would take 2-3 months. So everything that I heard my teams wanted to do, the answer was no. So I'm like, oh, okay, no, this is unacceptable. I will learn what we can do. And what's the interest behind it? Why the US government would write a regulation in the FAR, say in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, saying you need to do this, this, and that. So I got very nerdy. Well, I've always been nerdy, but I got really nerdy trying to really understand what was the so what behind it. Why somebody sitting in Congress would say we need to make sure that we prevent fraud, or that we prevent child abuse, or that we have a policy to, I don't know, support projects that then would hurt an important industry in the US. Like all those regs and all those things we had in our contracts, and I learned them. And because I am a second language speaker, I needed to understand them in a very simple way. And I was able to explain to people in a very simple way because I had a hard time understanding in a lawyer's English. So I sort of digest that, and I started giving training, and I started working with other English as a second language speakers. So we would all know what we could do, and we could plan ahead, and we would know, okay, if we want to do this, we know that we would need this authorization. We need to do this, and that. So we were always sort of at least knowing what the roadmap and what the different things that we needed to comply. So it made me feel less obstacles and more challenges and more things that we just needed to do in the road, and design the systems to be able to perform better.
That's very interesting, though. Being a non-native English speaker, having to learn, and the way that those regulations were written, it was very much legalese. It was written by lawyers for lawyer. I mean, not for lawyers, but it was written by lawyers and not filtered in any way for a lay person to look at and understand. So I remember the amount of time we'd spend unpacking all the regulations that, just kept developing and developing and piling up, largely in response to congressional pressure and mandates and all of that. But why don't we shift over to talk a bit about some of the projects you worked on? We started talking about your time in Peru, and that program was, well, maybe talk a bit about maybe an example of how the U.S. government funded project there, the USAID project you worked on. What did it do to try to replace coca production? We came in because, you want to give people alternative livelihood options from growing illicit crops. So yeah, I don't know, maybe I'm sure you have a couple of examples from that time.
Well, the one that comes to mind, and it was one that I love very much because it was innovative and I worked very closely. We were always wanting to have that middle ground between, these people have been growing coca all their lives. They get their money to survive through this crop. What are we going to give them so they can survive? But at the same time, there were economic theories that said, well, you just need to sell what the market is buying.
Right.
So that was sort of the premise. So I worked, and it was a request for proposals, and people just came in with different alternatives as to how we would address this. This was a plantain, like chips. It was a company that made chips, plantain chips. And they said that they were having a really difficult time receiving their plantain in the way that they needed to be able to produce these chips. And they were exporting some of their production. They needed to provide some technical assistance to the producers so they would get what they needed. And that was their proposal. So what we did was a cost sharing subcontracts. They have a vested interest. They are going to grow their business after all. So we need them to also share part of the cost of this technical assistance. So my project was financing part of the cost of the seeds, part of the cost of planting, getting all that stuff. And they were providing that technical assistance on packaging, on how to take it out. There were different people participating in making that whole chain stronger. So it was pretty successful to bring that private sector company that had that vested interest and work with the people in that community. And after USAID was no longer financing this contract, then they just continued with their business.
Now you see and that to me is gold. And those are my favorite kinds of activities. And there were a lot of those all over the world that USAID projects did where, what was rule number one? Do no harm, right? Don't enter a market and distort it. There's some element of that may be unavoidable and all that. But for the most part, I think in our old economic development projects, that example being a great one, we were looking for private sector partners where they have an interest, we have an interest, figure out where your interests overlap and intersect, and then create something together, right? And in that case, it's perfect. I mean, you're mobilizing private investment and private capital too, because it wasn't
There's
taxpayer
no other
money.
way. Yeah. I think that sort of the mind of ethics and protecting the taxpayers as if it was our dime, it was that notion of making sure that my taxes, because I was paying taxes, so it was I was directly involved. I think that's another idea, like being ethical. It's like doing the right thing, and being sustainable is also like, what are we going to leave after? Is this going to depend on our taxpayer money, or is this going to work without us after a while? Sometimes we would get it right. Sometimes not always. It wasn't perfect. I just don't want to give that image that everything was perfect.
Sure.
But yeah, for the most part, that was one of my obsessions, sustainability and ethics.
Right. And I'll tell you something interesting. When I started doing this work, I will admit maybe succumbing to, the mentality or the idea that when you go to a country that's less developed, there's generally more corruption than you might see, overt corruption than you might see in the US. And, I think people then make assumptions, or someone would say, oh, you're going to that country, it's very corrupt. I'm like, okay, does that mean all the people are corrupt though? No, in fact, it's often quite the opposite. What I found is that, especially that a lot of the people we would work with, Colombia and Mozambique and Haiti, you have people who a lot of them, they're not getting up in the morning and saying, I'm going to go do some corruption today or something, right?
They are even more obsessed.
They're more obsessed with it. They're more bothered by it, especially,
right.
And you could find those partners that you work with and, build the networks in country, develop the relationships, and you figure out and you ask people. I mean, we had where you and I used to work back in the day, there was also an anonymous phone line, right? Where, people could call in and report something.
Right.
We had to respond to all of those, right?
And the truth is, when you said countries where there's a lot of corruption, Bangladesh, I worked in Bangladesh for about 4 months, and my team in Bangladesh, they had developed a sense of smell, and they would catch things that I would be like amazed, and they were really incredible and correct, and they just wanted to make sure. For me, my motivation was to keep the American taxpayer dollars, like to keep them safe and well invested. For them, was this project was so important for them and for the development of their country that they needed for it to work. So everybody that was working with
Yeah.
foreign policy money or international development money, they have the motivation, but you just find incredible people that are there.
And I saw this firsthand all the time. Our reputation as Americans were the Americans are honest. And if you do something corrupt, you're going to get fired.
You're going to
Right?
get caught.
There was immediate recourse.
They were consequences. Somebody was saying the fear of God. And it was not just about stealing money. It was about safeguarding policies. It was about respecting the workplace. It was about drinking in the workplace or smoking. They were so many different policies. Like there's even a rule in our contracts that said that we should use print on double side. And then it was interesting.
Yeah, and actually, you reminded me of something funny when I was first starting out in this work. Remember, the DC-based teams are there as an extra layer of compliance and protection against fraud, abuse, corruption. So we'd review. I mean, if I remember correctly, this was halfway through the month, and then at the end of the month, every single month, the entire team would sit down. The project I was on was in Afghanistan. It's $161 million. So twice a month going through that. Well, I mean, halfway through the month you're at, $2 million of expenditures, and you're going through line by line by line. And I remember one time there was a line item that, it was like $5, $2, some ridiculously small charge for scotch, right? So we all looked at it and said, and that was the point, is you were looking for things like that to go back to your field office accounting team and say, hey, what is this charge? Did you buy a bottle of scotch? Did you buy, you're not allowed to use U.S. government funds, taxpayer money, to buy alcohol, right? We could never do that. And it was just one of those funny things where they wrote back and said, well, we meant tape, because it was non-native English speakers typing in, making the, doing the accounting entries, and they wrote scotch because they called tape scotch, right? There is no scotch except for the Americans. There's no scotch in Afghanistan. They don't drink. It's illegal, right? But
amazing.
It was funny, right? I mean, it certainly wasn't anything fraudulent, but that's the level of detail and nitpickiness that we engaged in, which, I'm not going to say I missed that part of it, but anyhow.
But there was always a point. It's preventing our company from getting this allowance, and at the same time is preventing US dollars from getting into the hands of the wrong people, the money that favors corrupt teams. Depending on the issues on the different countries, we were always just being more sensitive to one or the other.
Yeah. So we've gotten to cover a lot today, Andrea. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we conclude?
I would say that I feel extremely proud of the work that we did as individuals and the work that we did as U.S. citizens and the work that we did as a nation. We made very significant work and significant changes in the communities, and most of the people were working there because they had a passion and they wanted to serve. And I want to thank whoever of those teams that are listening to this in the field, and our partners and our friends in Washington, say thank you for all these years and all this great work.
And thank you for your work. And thanks a lot for talking with me. It's great to see you. And thanks to everyone for listening all the way through today. Once again, subscribe, and share, especially with your skeptical friends. We want to get these messages out and these stories out, these real stories and honest stories, to people who can learn the truth about what our work really looked like. So Alex Natsios from Unsung Americans signing out. Thank you very much.